Welcome back to Ryan and Brian's Bible Bistro. I'm Ryan.
And I'm Brian.
This is the Bible Bistro, a podcast all about the Bible, theology, and all things related to the Christian faith.
It is.
Yes,
It is.
welcome
and we're
back.
Reunited, and it feels so good.
Whoa, I didn't know. You know what? You used to accuse me of having musical episodes in the beginning because I would sing.
Well,
and
we
here
haven't
you
had
are.
one for a while, and
Yes.
you know, you got to give the people what they want. We've had all those letters.
Yes.
Saying, "Hey, where's a musical episode?"
Yeah, well,
So-
'cause I think in the early days you were the Phantom of the Opera, weren't you? I think it was.
well, we had discussions about that. I think,
Yes.
so.
Anyway, so we're back. We're at Bistro
Yeah.
East. We are reunited. We get to spend some time hanging out last
Hanging
night,
out.
talking about all kinds of things.
Yes,
Theological.
bad theology,
theology.
good theology.
Yeah, all the things theology.
The persistence of bad theology.
The persistence, the ever nagging. You can't quite root it out.
That might be the title of a book: "The Persistence of Bad Theology." Ooh. Think about
like
that.
that.
Think about that.
Yes.
Talked a little about Greek because you're getting ready to start learning.
Yes,
the
I'm starting my
Greek
seminary
language.
here. Yeah, I'm feeling a little.
Excited.
Yeah, that's it. That's it. Feeling like, I'm getting my
be
books
good.
and kind of going, okay.
It'll be good. You'll do.
Yeah. So
Send Ryan an encouraging message about his master's degree.
yes,
So.
going to pick up the master's degree here. So, but we're back, and so again, hint, we're trying to think of topics to talk about. But you had a good idea.
I think so. I've got a couple of. I have one or two.
You had a good idea. Yeah, you know what I did. I did have a good idea. Thank you for acknowledging.
So we talked about Jonah last time we were together,
Yes.
and one of the minor prophets, and I said Jonah's a little different in relation to the minor prophets. So it got me thinking about. I've gone through the minor prophets and teaching a couple of different times, and really I love them. There's such good material in there. Mm-hmm. We don't spend a ton of time in the minor prophets, but it got me thinking about a book that I really enjoy, which is Zechariah, the book of Zechariah. And I said to you, it's barely a minor prophet.
Right, the not so minor.
It's right. It's one of the longest. Well, it is the longest minor prophet. 14 chapters. Mm-hmm. Haggai, I think, has 14 chapters as well, but there's another one. Hosea, I'm sorry, not Haggai. Hosea has 14 chapters, but in terms of word count, Zechariah is the longest of the minor prophets.
Okay.
And so it's a little bit different for that reason. I love a lot of the imagery, though, and there's a couple of things in the Gospel of John that Zechariah helps illuminate, and we were talking to some of our listeners, and the idea of how Jonah, we looked at the way it was used in the New Testament, was an interesting part of that. So I thought we would do a little of that along the way, but we'll do some weeks on Zechariah where we have some interviews hopefully coming up that will be interspersed with these, but it always helps for us to have something to kind of look forward to and think
something
about.
that kind of grounds us as we move along.
It's
So
not just like random episodes. Let's talk about this. Let's talk about that. So anyway, let's talk about Zechariah.
All right.
Zechariah is mentioned in the book of Ezra in a couple places. Why don't you look that up for me? Ezra chapter 5. Do you have that already?
I can look it up.
Well,
real quick.
I've got it already.
Okay, go ahead.
In Ezra chapter 5, verses 1 and 2, and then also in Ezra 6. So here's 1 and 2. You look up Ezra 6, and I'll also... So this is the return from exile, and I'm getting ready to, what we'll do after this, let me kind of give you an idea of how I think this episode is going to flow, at least as near as we can tell at this point, is we'll talk a little bit about where Zechariah occurs, where he prophesies in regard to the larger timeline of exile and return, because he's one of these prophets we call the post-exilic prophets. He's prophesying after the exile. So we'll talk about the timeline that leads us up to where Zechariah is, and then we're going to look at the first couple of visions that he has, first couple of parts of the book of Zechariah, and we'll talk more about what happens there. But another interesting thing about Zechariah I mentioned to you last night is you can date him very specifically. There are a couple of dates he mentions that are more specific. We don't usually have that in biblical books, right?
Right.
But there's a couple of them he gives very specific dates for, and we talked about specific dates like we think about 9/11 or and we can date things like the destruction of the temple in those kind of ways. I just had what's that?
Or Pearl Harbor. Or
Right.
Yeah.
I just had a friend he's a big well, I'm trying to think how to describe him, but anyway, he just went to. I'm not going to try.
I've got a friend. I'm not going to describe him. I'm just going to tell you this.
But he just went to Dealey Plaza, and so the date there of 1963, November 1963. These very specific kind of dates that we have. Anyway, you probably don't remember 1963.
It was no, I don't. I can't say anything about the year.
So Zechariah and then also the prophet Haggai were both prophesying during this period of time, and both of them are mentioned here in Ezra chapter 5. So now Haggai the prophet and Zechariah the prophet, a descendant of Edo, or son of Edo, prophesied to the Jews in Judah and Jerusalem in the name of the God of Israel who was over them. Then Zerubbabel, and we'll come back to that name a little bit later, that's a leader of the people, son of Shealtiel, and Joshua, son of Jozadak, I should have practice this, set to work to rebuild the house of God in Jerusalem. So we're talking about the rebuilding of the temple. And the prophets of God were there, were with them, supporting them. So this really kind of gives away what Zechariah and Haggai are both focused on, which is the rebuilding of the temple after the exiles have returned from their
Babylonian exile.
And
the Persians now have sent them back.
And we'll talk about that a little bit. So read chapter 16 or 6 verses 14 and 15. Both of these are from the book of Ezra.
Yep. So the elders of the Jews continued to build and prosper under the preaching of Haggai the prophet and Zechariah, a descendant of Iddo. They finished building the temple according to the command of the God of Israel and the decrees of Cyrus, Darius, and Artaxerxes, kings of Persia.
So you mentioned this idea of Persia. So let's go back and talk a little bit about the timeline of what's going on throughout here. So the first invasion of Judah, and Judah was invaded by the Assyrians, you might remember, and then the Babylonians. But 606 was the first invasion. Then the date that we usually talk about for the destruction is 586 BC is the destruction of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple. At that time, the emperor of Babylon was Nebuchadnezzar. And so he's the one who takes the final group of Judeans and people of Judah into exile. So we have that period of time. So the reason I mentioned 606 is we have this prophecy in Isaiah and Jeremiah of 70 years of captivity, right? And so a lot of people will date from 606 because we're going to see that when at least the initial group of people leave exile and go back to Judah is about 536. So that gives us the 70 years.
So the 70 years isn't necessarily dated off the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, but when the Judeans start being...
If it's important to you to have the 70 years... Well, I mean, seriously. I mean, if that's...
I'm just trying to clarify...
I'm just saying that there are many people who date 606. That's the beginning of the exile. 536 into the exile. That's exactly 70 years. So that's all I'm going to say. That's all I'm going to say about that. So what else was it? Now
I've flustered you.
And so then Nebuchadnezzar's son is named Amel Marduk, or evil Mordok, is what we see in the book of 2 Kings. The book of 2 Kings, and I think I've talked about this before on this podcast. Maybe I talk about it a lot, but the book of 2 Kings ends with Jehoiakim, who was the king of Judah, who had been taken into exile, released from prison, released from chains, and brought to eat at the table of evil Mordok. Or Ul, I think the newer translations call it Ul Mordok. Anyway, it doesn't matter. Some dude named...
If language is important to you.
The son of Nebuchadnezzar. Well, it's always hard to transliterate, right? But he brings Jehoiakim, and he eats at the king table for the rest of his life. Now, I always say that shows us that 2 Kings ends on a note of hope, because Jehoiakim, the king of Judah, is a direct descendant of David. And you got to remember the promise that God made. You'll never fail to have a man on the throne of Israel. One of your descendants is going to reign eternally on the throne of Israel, which, again, that for those who were living through exile, that would have pointed toward, but we've got this descendant of David who is still alive.
Zerubbabel.
Well, Zerubbabel becomes that, yeah.
Yes.
So Zerubbabel's a descendant of David. He's the one then. So we're getting into this timeline again, and I know there's a lot here. So the Persians then defeat the Babylonians, and you'll remember we talked about this in Daniel. If you want to go back and listen to one of our Daniel episodes, the one on Daniel 6 talks about the date of, again, something we can date very exactly. And so that takes place in 539 BC. And then Cyrus releases captives, and he doesn't just do this for the captives from Judah, but he does this from all of the captives that the Babylonians have taken. He kind of pins his reputation on being the one who's freeing all these captives and letting them go back to their homeland. The Cyrus cylinder, the Cyrus decree, which I think we've talked about before. You see that at the very beginning of the book of Ezra, chapter 1, the very first 4 verses of Ezra, is the Cyrus decree allowing them to go back. And so Zerubbabel leads back about 50,000, more or less, descendants or people from Judah back to this land. And again, 50,000 would not, 70 years of captivity, these would not have been the ones who were originally taken out of captivity. There would have been some among the older, as we read about in the book of Ezra, when they finished the temple building. But there would have been many of these who would have been born in captivity and never would have seen Judah until they come. We've talked about this before as well, but not everybody returns from exile.
Right.
Within that 2 generations or generation and a half at least, you've got people getting married, you've got them having children, you've got them
People dying.
Dying, having getting occupations. And so there are some who are very comfortable. So we always talk about this righteous remnant. There's this idea that these are the ones who are really determined. They're the ones who have the vision to restore God's people in the land that God had promised and to restore the temple and for things to be different this time. So that's the group that we see going back. And this is where we get the book of Ezra. That's what we get in chapter 5. So they come back, and one of the first things that they want to do is they want to get the altar placed back where it belongs, because there's a very specific place that God had commanded that the temple was to be, the altar burnt offering was to be in a very particular place. So they get that established. But then you'll remember, if you read the book of Ezra, and also we see this in the book of Nehemiah, which were originally one book, but they become distracted. There's opposition because there's people who've remained back in the land, and that's where we've talked about before the Samaritans, this idea of the opposition that they receive. So there's opposition. There's also, and this is the other thing I kind of wanted to get across in this timeline, is there was also a lot going on in the larger political world. This was a time of political upset and turmoil. Babylonians to the Persians. Now, again, Cyrus has a much more, how do I say this, a much kinder treatment of people from other places. But then the Persians eventually come down, and in 525, they defeat the Egyptians. And I always say this, when we think about the Promised Land, whoever's in control of Mesopotamia, who at this period of time is Persia, and whoever controls Egypt, those are the major superpowers, and they're battling back and forth. So when the Persians come through in 525 BC, and I don't know if I gave you this date or not, but they come back in about 538, 537. The people of Judah come back about 538, 537 BC, and they begin this process of rebuilding the temple. But then in 525, Persia defeats Egypt. And again, think about this upheaval. The Persians would have had to march through the promised land in order to get down to Egypt, and there would have been a lot of uncertainty in this kind of thing. So this gets us to Zechariah. And Zechariah has 3 dates that he mentions that give us very specific information about when he writes. The first is in Zechariah chapter 1 and verse 1. He says this: in the 8th month, and this is according to the reckoning of the Jewish calendar, Zechariah 1:1, in the 8th month of the 2nd year of Darius, the word of the Lord came to the prophet Zechariah, son of Berechiah, the son of Iddo. So there's the descendant of Iddo that we saw in Ezra. So that date, that first prophecy that we see, and it's a very short prophecy, but we call this the beginning of Zechariah's ministry, really. It would have been October of 520 BC. So 5 years or so after Egypt has finally been defeated, the Persians are controlling this entire part of the world during this period of time. then we find the first prophecy that Zechariah makes. The second date he mentions is several months later. This is in Zechariah chapter 1, verse 7. So just down a little bit. We're going to look at this first prophecy. That's verses 2 through 6. We're going to look at that today. And then on the 24th day of the 11th month, the month of Shabbat, in the second year of Darius, the word of the Lord came to the prophet Zechariah, son of Berechiah, the son of Iddo. So we have this very short prophecy initially in October of 520 BC, and then February the 15th of 519 BC, the next year, so several, October to February, think about, we have this second prophecy. And the second prophecy we call the night visions. And there's a series of 8 visions that he has. And you can see it here. I'm going to read just the very first part of verse 8. It says, during the night, this is why we call them the night visions. During the night, I had a vision. And we'll talk about that vision today as well. But skip down and look at verse 18.
Okay.
Then I looked, and there was before me. So here's the second vision. Down in chapter 2, verse 1. Then I looked, and there was, and then down in chapter 3, then he showed me. And so we have the series of 8 different times that Zechariah says, I saw this, and then I saw this, and then I saw this. So these 8 visions are messages that he's given to give to the people. And basically, again, the whole point of this is to encourage them in the rebuilding of the temple. They've been distracted. Again, political upheaval, the opposition they've received have kept them from finishing the temple. And so Zechariah basically comes along, and he and Haggai, and their message is you need to get the temple completed. I think even here there's an interesting kind of thing for us to think about. Because I'm sure when these people came back, that's what they wanted, right? Think about the exilic prophets. Daniel, we talked about. Here's the example in Daniel. Daniel, every day, what was his habit?
He'd go up and pray towards Jerusalem.
Toward Jerusalem. So he's thinking about the restoration of the temple. Ezekiel, here he is prophesying to the Babylonians, and you remember the vision that he has of the temple. And so his whole thing is about the rebuilding of the temple. You see this in chapter 47 of Ezekiel. You see it in chapter 37. These visions he has of the rebuilding of the temple, the restoration of Israel to the land. That's what he's all about. And so these people that come back with Zerubbabel, I'm sure they're on fire. Let's get this thing rebuilt, right? Let's get this done. This is what we're longing for. But then they become distracted by these other things that are going on around them, and pretty soon it's put on the back burner. And the only thing I say there is it's kind of a message for us as God's people. We've talked about this,
right?
Mission creep and these different things that can distract us from the primary thing that it is that God is calling us to do. The building of his kingdom, right? Seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, right? And we become distracted by, dare I say, political things that are going on around us.
Maybe that's a problem for you. I don't think it's a problem for everybody else.
But we become distracted by the things of life, right? Opposition, things getting in our way, and it can slow us down from building the kingdom of God, that he's, from using the things that he has gifted us with in order to accomplish the work that he's given to us, the mission he's given to us. So anyway, so that's the second vision. That's the first major part of Zechariah. And we'll spend a couple of 3 weeks, maybe 4, looking at those visions. We're looking at the first one today, the night visions.
Okay.
And then down in Zechariah chapter 7, verse 1 is the third date, the final date that I want to talk about. So chapter 7, this is Zechariah chapter 7, verse 1. In the 4th year of King Darius, the word of the Lord came to Zechariah on the 4th day of the 9th month, the month of Kislev. So this is then another prophecy that is given him, a word of encouragement that's given to him, which can be dated to December 7th, 518 BC. So we go from February of 519 to December of 518. So we're talking about basically 22 months later than this other vision is called. And I just find this fascinating. One of the things I love about Zechariah is just the specificity. Again, there's so many of these books where we're like, well, it's probably around here sometime.
Right. But this one,
it could be here. Right. And he's very specific. Here are the dates. And we can even see something about how do I say this? The breadth of his ministry, right? From this period where he begins his preaching to the people, and Ezra talks about that. Haggai and Zechariah raise up, and then later he mentions them again, that they're encouraging the building of the temple. And we at the same time can look at the book of Zechariah, and we see something about the development of this message that he's given by God to give to the people. And so I just find that very interesting. Thoughts on that so far? That's a lot to digest up front.
I don't know if there's a lot to. I mean, I like having specific dates. I mean,
historical.
I think this is, yeah. I mean, that's one of the things that I think. I mean, this is not the topic of this episode, but that's always the thing that people get when we start about biblical criticism. Is people's like, oh, it's just we don't know exactly this happened. Right. Yeah, it's myth, and it's just like, why would someone write this with such specificity?
Right.
If they're trying to pull the wool over someone's eyes at some point and so forth. So no, I think it's great.
Okay, so let's look at these first couple of prophecies then. The first one is basically Zechariah chapter 1, verses 2 through 6. So it's kind of a short message, and this is the first one that comes in about 520 BC, October 520 BC again, is what we're thinking about. So go ahead and read verses 2 and 3 for me, and then we'll unpack just a little bit of this.
Yahweh was very angry with your ancestors. Therefore tell the people, this is what the Lord Almighty says. Return to me, declares the Lord Almighty, and I will return to you, says Yahweh Almighty.
Okay. So the first thing I want you to notice, and this is a good thing for us to learn in Hebrew, is in Hebrew, the way that you make an emphatic statement is repetition. So we use words, comparatives and superlatives. So, the superlative is kind of like the best, right? This is good, but this is the best, right? And to make a superlative in Hebrew, you pile up the terms. So what it literally says here is that Yahweh was angry in his anger. Basically, he was very angry is the way that we have it translated. But it's a doubling of that term anger. The most commonplace example I always use is we talk about the Holy of Holies in the temple. And that's literally what the phrase is, the Holy of Holies. But we sometimes will translate the most holy place because that's really what it's doing. It's making it a superlative,
it's superlative,
right?
Yeah. Okay.
So here's this idea. The Lord was angry with anger at your ancestors. So the message is going back to these previous generations, and particularly the ones that led up to the exile. God was angry with them because of their disobedience. Again, the book of 2 Kings, you look at those last kings, things just go downhill. I always mention Jeroboam the second. From the time of Jeroboam the second on down, things just keep getting worse and worse and worse. I mean, they were already bad, but this is just, it goes in the toilet. And so basically God says here, through Zechariah, God was very angry with your ancestors. So that's the first part of this. And then we have this idea of return. And I find this interesting. We talk about return as a way of talking about coming back to God, right? It's not coming to God for the first time. It's that you have left him and now you're called to return. So we talk about repentance, for example, is a fancy word that we use a lot in the New Testament period, and it's used in the Old Testament as well. But this idea of turning back or returning to God is the call here. So God was very angry with the ancestors, but he is calling them to return. And I find this interesting. He says, if you return to me, then I will return to you. And I guess kind of the way I want to think about this a little bit, just kind of sermonize on it a little bit, is they were very focused on the return to the land, right? Getting back to the land. And God is saying, but you also need to return to me. You need to make sure that you're turning yourself back to me. And so that's kind of what I think is the primary message here. If you return to me, then the promise God says is that I will return to you. So not only is it a matter of them coming back to the land, but they also need to be his people. They need to be obedient, and that's the message. Now, here's how he does this. He gives them a further example about their ancestors. So this is verses 4 through 6.
Yeah. Do not be like your ancestors, to whom the earlier prophets proclaimed, this is what the Lord Almighty says. Turn from your evil ways and your evil practices. But they would not listen or pay attention to me, declares the Lord. Where are your ancestors now? And the prophets, do they live forever? But did not my words and my decrees, which I commanded my servants the prophets, overtake your ancestors? Then they repented and said, the Lord Almighty has done to us what our ways and practices deserve, just as he determined to do.
So he's talking here about the nature of prophecy and people's response to it. So he's saying that I sent prophets before, and I find this interesting. Again, at beginning of Zechariah's ministry.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
This is him kind of saying, God is telling me that he sent prophets before, but they didn't listen. They did not return. They did not turn themselves, from the ways that they were warning. And I'll come back to this in a minute. So you think about those former prophets. We're thinking about people like Isaiah, right? And think about all the warnings he gave them,
right?
And you think even about all the way back to Elijah and Elisha, and the warnings he gave against Baal worship and the illustrations that they gave him. So we have those prophets that we read about in the historical books like Elijah and Elisha, but then we also have these written prophets like Isaiah and Joel and Amos, all these others that are saying, look, here you've got to turn back. Don't take advantage of people, show mercy to people, be obedient to God. These are the messages that these prophets are giving. And so Zechariah, I think, again, it's interesting. He begins his ministry by saying, look what happened when the people failed to listen to God's prophets. So I wanted to mention this. There's two verbs here, and this is kind of a minor point, but I find it very interesting. This is verse 4. This is what the Lord Almighty says: turn from your evil ways and your evil practices. But they would not listen. This is the NIV. Mm-hmm. They would not listen or pay attention, is the way that the NIV has translated this. Mm-hmm. These are really two verbs for listening. Mm-hmm. So the first verb is the word shema. The verb shema, which we know from the famous Shema. And how does it begin? Hear, O Israel. Yeah. So that's the command, right? Mm-hmm. Listen, hear. This is what the Lord says, and that's where we get that word Shema. We call it the Shema because it begins with that idea of hear. Listen is the idea. And then the second word is a different word for listen, kashav. But these two together, it's kind of the idea, and by the way, it's in a form that talks about a cause, something that causes something else, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But he basically says, listen. They did not listen, and they did not hear. It's literally what they're saying. And this reminds me sometimes of conversations we may have with people when we're kind of in an argument, right?
Yes.
It's like maybe. Let me see. How can I say this nicely? You say, I was going to use my wife as an example, but I won't. I shouldn't do that. So your kids, you might say, now listen. You listen to what I'm saying. You're not listening to me, right? And
yes.
that's kind of the emphasis here is not simply a matter of hearing, but then the causative. What are you going to do? Are you going to hearken to it, right? Or I don't know how to say this in English. Are you going to respond to the message? You know what I'm saying? Because you know as well as I do, there's a difference between listening and there's a difference between obeying, right?
Right.
But we can say that. Listen to what I say. When we say that to the kids, you didn't listen to me. What we're really saying is you didn't do what I asked you to do. Yeah. And so this is the message that God has for his people is the previous generations, even though I sent them prophets, they didn't listen to what I have to say. They didn't hear it. They didn't obey it. Is basically what it comes down to.
I was kind of looking this up here. It kind of reminds me of Matthew in Matthew 23
sure.
when Jesus says like, "How I'd long Jerusalem, who kills the prophets and stones them?
Right.
Those who sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together as hens gather her chicks under her wings,
but you were not.
Well, you were not willing or listen."
Yeah. That's interesting. Yeah, it's a very similar kind of thing. And again, apply it to us today. It's one thing for us to know what the Word of God is. It's another for us to respond to it in a proper way. So then the warning continues, and basically he says, where are they now? And the implications, well, they're all dead.
Right. Yeah.
Many of them
it's a rhetorical question.
Many of them are in graves, or it is, and many of them are in graves in Babylon. Right? They died in exile because they did not listen to me. And even the prophets are gone now, he's saying. Even Jeremiah and Isaiah, they're gone. Mm-hmm. But you see what he contrasts here? My word stands. the decrees that I made through them is what is eternal.
Right.
So God's word has, and I love the way he says it's overtaken them. So,
Yes.
so they were running away. I heard somebody say this recently. They were talking about wisdom, and God's wisdom is pursuing you, but you're just too fast.
That's funny.
So they're out running ahead of God's decrees, but eventually God's decrees are the ones that catch up and pass them. And so this is God basically saying, look, my words stand. And then the repentance is this idea that they turn back to God, and then he releases them from captivity and brings them back. But you get the warning. Don't be like that again. We can go through this again.
Yeah. Well, I was just thinking, like Isaiah is writing prophecies while the Assyrians are coming down, they're laying siege to Jerusalem.
That's exactly right. You can see it in the northern kingdom. The northern kingdom is destroyed.
already been, yeah. So, they're all walled in, they're under siege. And Isaiah is writing this stuff like this is going to happen. Like, you are Herod's breath away. Like, God relented, and destroyed the Assyrians. But, you have Isaiah who's warning them. Then you have Jeremiah who's preparing them for what's to come for Babylon.
You said a hair's breadth. It made me think, preparing them for this. It made me think of that. I'm trying to remember. I think it's in Isaiah where it's like it's going to be like a razor. It's going to
shave you. Yes. And that's exactly what happens, because there's 180,000 soldiers sitting outside the gates. 180,000. For those who are counting, if you need to put a number on it. Oh my gosh. I'm trying to contribute something to this podcast.
You're doing great. You're doing great.
But that they're as close as you can to total Judean destruction as well.
Yeah.
And I'm done. You
did great.
You sucked the wind from my sails, Brian.
I apologize. You were doing fantastic. But that's the message here that he gives in this first one. Any other thoughts on that before we
no.
Well, let's talk about these first of the night visions then. So, again, verse 7, on the 24th day of the 11th month, the month of Shabbat, on the second year of Darius, the word of the Lord came to the prophet Zechariah, son of Berechiah, son of Iddo. So he had this first message in October, and then the following February, here are these 8 visions that he has at night, and they contain proclamation, we're going to see. So we're going to look at just the first one of these 8 visions today. So read verses 8 and 9. This is setting the scene for what's going on.
During the night I had a vision, and there before me was a man mounted on a red horse. He was standing among the myrtle trees in a ravine. Behind him were red, brown, and white horses.
Now, we've talked about colored horses before.
Yes.
We've had this in the book of Revelation. Red here, some people would say might be better roan, or, there might be different ones. But here are these different colors, and there's lots of disagreement over the significance of the colors of these horses and what it means. I'm not going to spend too much time on this today. I really think there's not too much significance to be attached to it here. Later on, then it begins to develop. And by the time we get to the book of Revelation, we see, I think, again, very specific symbolic meaning attached to these colored horses. But what I'm going to tell you is this: I saw a man, and I'll go ahead and give this away because it's going to be just a few verses we see this. These are angels. These are divine messengers that God has sent in order to kind of see what's going on. That's the long and short of it. So they're on horses, which means talks about their swiftness, talks about the power of them being able to go wherever is necessary in order to see what's going on. The only thing I really want to point out here, it says he was standing among the myrtle trees. And myrtle trees are kind of evergreen shrubs. They're mentioned in connection to the Feast of Tabernacles. You're supposed to go cut down the myrtles and build your tabernacle, your tent, where you live outside during the Feast of Tabernacles, out of myrtle trees, out of myrtle branches. That's what you're supposed to use. And so if there's any symbolic significance to this, and I'll just say, historically, during this period of time, myrtle trees would have surrounded all of Jerusalem. That would have been a very plentiful tree during that period of time around Jerusalem. And so if there's any symbolic value, it has to do with God's protection of his people. The God, that, because that's what Tabernacles is about, right? I'm able to give you what you need in order to protect from, I'm providing for you. You think about the wilderness wanderings, and I provided for you during that period of time. So we're kind of maybe going back to that imagery, maybe. But the most significant thing I think here is notice that he's standing among the myrtle trees in a ravine, is the way that this is translated in the NIV, or in a deep valley. And that word is a word that can be translated the depths. It's often used poetically for, in a spiritual sense. So
this isn't connected like to Sheol, like with Jonah.
it's not Sheol, but it's the abyss. It can be translated, or the depths, right? It's the idea of sinking down into the depths. So we even use the word valley like this, right? I was going through a valley, and I think that may be what's being gotten at here. Is he has this vision, and here's where God's people are right now. They're in the valley. They're in the depth, and they've stalled out on their mission. There's been all the stuff going on around them that has distracted them. The political upheaval and the political intrigue that's going on around them has stopped them in their tracks, and so they're in the depths now. And so Zechariah's message begins there, is kind of the way that I would put that. And so, did you read verse 9? He said, "What are these, my Lord?" It sounds a lot like the book of Revelation, right?
Yeah, it does.
John says this. So Zechariah has this kind of apocalyptic character where you have this question from a mortal to a divine messenger saying, "Explain this stuff to me. Help me understand what's going on." And again, apocalyptic always has this message that is things are beneath the surface are different than they might seem on the outside, right? The way that they might seem to you is different than how they really are at a spiritual level. And so this is the message then. So go ahead with verses 10 and 11.
Yeah. Then the man standing among the myrtle trees explained, "They are the ones the Lord has sent to go throughout the earth. And they reported to the angel of the Lord who was standing among the myrtle trees, 'We have gone throughout the earth and found the whole world at rest and in peace.'"
Now that's an unusual message, right? Yeah. That's not what we normally see. But God's messengers on horses, right? So these are the angels on horses. These are fast angels, have gone out throughout the entire world, and they found all of these Gentile nations now at peace. Okay. Persia has finally defeated Egypt. Right, the empire is complete, so to speak. The two major superpowers are no longer in conflict, and the entire world is at peace. Okay, so that's the context. There's been this political upheaval. There's been this political upset that has kept you from your mission. Now the whole world's at peace. So I want you to notice this next thing that happens. Look at verses 12 and 13. Go ahead and just read the very first part of verse 12, and I'll tell you when to stop here.
Then the angel of the Lord said, "Lord Almighty, how long will you withhold mercy?"
Okay. There's the question. I say this is the perennial question for God's people. How long, O Lord?
This is Revelation.
This is Revelation, right? How long, O Lord, faithful and true, until you avenge our blood, right?
Yeah.
Habakkuk, at an earlier period of time when the Babylonians are before they even come, he looks at the evil of, this is Habakkuk, he looks at the evil of God's people and says, "How long, O Lord, until you do something about this?" And God says, "Well, I'm getting ready to send the Babylonians," right? So here's this question again. So the whole world's at peace. How long until you look at your people again with mercy? So go ahead and read that again. So 12 and 13.
Yeah. So then the angel of the Lord said, "Lord Almighty, how long will you withhold mercy from Jerusalem and from the towns of Judah, which you have been angry with these 70 years? So the Lord spoke kind and comforting words to the angel who talked with me."
So good and comforting, or kind and comforting words. So Zechariah says, what's going on here? What am I seeing? And he says, these are the angels that have gone throughout the world. They found the world at peace. And so then this angel says to God, "How long until you show mercy to Judah?" Remember the first prophecy, your ancestors messed up. God was very angry with your ancestors because of their disobedience, right? That's the beginning of the message. Don't be like that. And now the message is the world's at peace. How long until you begin to show mercy to Judah again? So things are not going well there. There's been opposition. Things are not the way that they imagined them to be. And so now the message is how long until this begins? And the message is a good message. God speaks to the angel. We don't have the content at this point, but he says he speaks kind and comforting words. Okay, so God is basically saying this is a good report. Things are not gonna continue as they are. Thoughts on that, or any questions or comments?
No, I think that's good.
So the question is, when are God's people going to experience peace the way the rest of the Gentile world is experiencing peace?
Well,
at this
I guess
point?
I do have a question here. So, withhold mercy from Jerusalem and from the towns of Judah.
Right.
I mean, this is a very specific Southern Kingdom
Yep.
focus. I mean,
That's who's back. That's God's people who are back now. Yeah.
So what's happening? I mean, what's happening in Samaria then? I mean,
Yeah.
isn't this when Mount Gerizim is
Sure. Mount Gerizim's there.
The second temple's being built.
Well, that
Or it's already
temple's
built.
Yeah, and then we've got this. Yeah, we've got opposition. That's the thing. When you read Nehemiah, and in Ezra too, but when you read Nehemiah, he comes back. And he's like, we got to get these walls in place. Jerusalem is desolate. Remember, that's his big concern. And the Samaritans are like, you guys have been gone for 70 years, and we're okay.
Yeah, because they'd come back from Assyria. Like, they hadn't been displaced as much as from the Assyrians, right?
No. So here's how the Assyrians did it. So here's the difference. The Assyrians took people and brought other people in. So what there is there's mixed marriages. There's these are they would consider them to be foreign people, right? The Jews and this is really Ezra when the first time you can use the word Jews, but the people of Judah would not have considered them to be fully God's people.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Whereas they read again the Samaritan Pentateuch and all this kind of stuff, they would have seen themselves as God's true people. So the people of Judah, the Judeans, let's call them, that's where the word Jew comes from. It just means Iudaioi in Greek. When the Judeans come back, then there's this sense that we've already got a capital here. We don't need Jerusalem back. We don't need you guys. And so that's the opposition we're talking about.
Yeah.
And you remember Nehemiah. I love the image. I don't know when's the last time you went through Nehemiah, but they're laying bricks with one hand and they got their other hand on the sword.
Yeah.
You remember that whole image? It's like they're rebuilding the walls, but it's like, in our nomenclature, it's like they got their gun on their hip, with one hand on the hip, and they're rebuilding
like
their house.
They're frontiersmen at some point.
Exactly. They're dealing with this opposition. And so I'm trying to remember your initial question.
Well,
now.
it was just about what was happening, like this was specifically focused on Jerusalem and Judea, not the full 12 tribe, but it was, it was the southern kingdom.
Exactly.
And just what, that opposition included some who were partially, still had some relationship to them, were from the tribes, but were Samaritan.
Right.
And that there was there's a conflict of capitals happening here as well. It wasn't just, there's other people around us. It's a conflict of capitals. Where do we worship?
It's political within not in terms of the Gentile world, but within the promised land.
In the promised land, there was a conflict of where do we worship, and there's a power battle there, political as well.
I wouldn't plan to do this. It's interesting. Ezekiel has one of the best images of this, I think. And again, remember, he's writing during the exile. And God says to him at one point, God always gives him, Ezekiel would have been a great youth minister because he always gives him these object lessons. So he says, take a stick and I want you to break it in half, right? And I want you to write on one belonging to Judah and the tribes associated with it, and on the other belonging to Israel and the tribes associated with it. And then I want you to put them together in your hand and walk around until basically people say, what are you doing, Ezekiel? And then you're to tell them this is the whole house of Israel. In other words, God is going to bring back the people and he's going to join them together again. So there is that prophecy, and I know where you're going with this. There's some other people.
I guess my thing here is just kind of going like, this is not just. I think sometimes we get into this like this is a proclamation for Judea, not for the all of Israel. And the word Israel takes on different meanings as we go through the Old Testament, but it's not for the 12 tribes. This is for
Judah and Benjamin and Levi.
Right.
Yeah. And so
I just thought that was interesting.
Yeah, it is. And they're the ones who've come back. They're the ones who are the priests. They're Zerubbabel, Joshua, these are the ones who are doing it. Right. And this is the place that God had said, my my heart and my eyes will be there forever, right? This is Jerusalem. And so yeah, that's what's going on here. Anything else? That you
No,
wanna-
it was just the Jerusalem Judea thing as we
Yeah.
think about, or Judah.
Yeah, Judah. Go ahead and read verses 14 through 17, then we'll finish this up.
Then the angel who was speaking to me said, "Proclaim this word."
So here it is. Here's
Proclaim.
your message.
There's the imperative. Proclaim this word. This is what the Lord Almighty says. I am very jealous for Jerusalem and Zion, and I am very angry with the nations that feel
Okay,
secure.
stop just a minute. I want to show you this. So very jealous. I am jealous with jealousy, and I am angry with anger. So there's that emphatic
okay.
again. So you see, I am jealous with jealousy for Jerusalem and Zion. So go ahead now.
Yeah. And I'm very angry with the nations that feel secure. I was only a little angry, but they went too far with the punishment.
So he sent his people into exile, and these foreign nations were the means of his punishment. And this is even prophesied in Isaiah. If you'll remember, Isaiah in chapter 10, for example, talks about, I'm going to use these other nations like tools in my hand, but when I am done with them and their pride becomes great, then I'm going to cast them away. And that's the same with Habakkuk too, because the prophecy is, you want to see some justice done? I'm going to bring the Babylonians. And then Habakkuk's like, wait a minute, they're worse than we are. What are you talking about? But then God says, I'm going to use them to accomplish this, but then I'm going to, in turn, bring punishment on them, which we see the Persians again and the Babylonians, Belshazzar, his pride. Here's this foreign army surrounding his, again, go back to our Daniel episode, read Herodotus. Here's this army.
That very night.
Here's this army surrounding Belshazzar, and he's like, bring out the golden cups from the temple and let's have a drink. And he can't see literally the writing on the wall, right? And so that's, again, that's that whole thing. I was a little angry with them, but they went too far. And so now I'm gonna take care of them. Go ahead. Sorry, I keep interrupting you.
That's all right. Therefore, this is what the Lord says: I will return to Jerusalem with mercy, and there my house will be rebuilt, and the measuring line will be stretched out over Jerusalem, declares the Lord Almighty. Proclaim further, this is what the Lord Almighty says: my towns will again overflow with prosperity, and the Lord will again comfort Zion and choose Jerusalem.
So I'm jealous with jealousy. We think of jealousy as a bad thing, and it is, but
It really turned off Oprah when she was trying to be a Christian.
oh, really, the word jealousy?
Yeah, she didn't like the idea of a jealous God.
And so the zealous, but basically it's saying they are my people. Right. These and the whole idea I've talked about before, that, this image of God. Well, even again, Revelation, I saw the new Jerusalem coming down of heaven as like a bride beautifully adorned for her husband. Right. God sees himself in a marriage with his people, that kind of intimacy, that kind of exclusivity. He wants to be the husband for his people. And we've talked before about idol worship is seen as adultery. It's seen as faithlessness. And so I am jealous for my people. I want my people to be mine, right? I don't want them to go other directions. I don't want them to be involved in other things. So I'm going to take care of my people. That's the message. I'm going to do damage to these nations that have done damage to them. They went too far with their punishment. And then I want you to notice this, because we're going to come back to it next week, a measuring line. Because he says, first of all, I will return to Jerusalem with mercy, and there my house will be rebuilt. Temple, importance of the temple, and the symbolism of the temple we've talked about before. This idea that it is where God's presence is, and it is the way that you draw near to God. Right, you need the sacrificial system in order to draw near to God and be in His presence. And so He says, "My house will be rebuilt, so I can regain that sense of intimacy and connection with my people." So a measuring line. Zechariah, it's going to be very fascinating to see this. Zechariah uses all kinds of imagery of building materials, because he's talking about rebuilding of the temple, but he uses them in symbolic ways. And so here's the measuring line. Ezekiel even used this when he talked about the temple. You might remember the angel told me to take a line and measure, and I told him it was 47,000 cubits on this side, and there's all this
revelation.
You see the measuring line there, and that comes from these images in this apocalyptic literature in the Old Testament. But this idea of a measuring line. So the architects are going to be about a rebuilding. Zerubbabel's temple is going to be rebuilt. Now we already know, not to give away the ending, it's not going to be nearly like Solomon's temple was, right? But the measuring line will be stretched out, God says, and my house will be rebuilt. Then we have this, and you mentioned the towns of Judah. So it's not just Jerusalem that God is jealous for, but these other towns of Judah will prosper. Mm-hmm. In other words, they will begin to become prosperous as well. Those were the ones that were destroyed again. In fact, they even had trouble during that Assyrian period. You might remember when they laid siege to Jerusalem. The northern towns were decimated or were destroyed given difficulties during that period of time. Those were some of the first ones taken into exile. And God says they will again experience, what's the word I'm looking for? Prosperity. They're gonna be able to prosper again under my hand is basically the idea.
Okay.
So God is promising that things are going to return to the way that they were, and He will return. Remember that first prophecy: "Return to me, and I'll return to you." So, there was one thing I forgot to say. Anyway, any questions or comments before I go back?
I don't know if there is. No, I think this is. No, I don't think I have any questions here.
I want to go back to that first prophecy. There's one thing I just found really interesting. I thought we should talk about. This is the end of verse 6. I can't believe I forgot this. We got talking about something else. Then they repented and said, "Yahweh Almighty has done for us what our ways and our practices deserve, just as He determined to do." I was going to talk about this when I talk about those former prophets. God said what was going to happen. That was that was what He determined, right? Mm-hmm. At the time He determined. He's 70 years, the whole thing. But notice it's what our actions deserved. So I find this a really interesting connection between God's set purpose and people's choices, right? They chose to disobey. Their deeds were wicked. When He called them back, they did not listen, but they did what they wanted to do, and it brought about the destruction that He determined. So we're always, one of the things we're always talking about is this idea of God's sovereignty and free will and the connection between them. And I saw that passage as one that really kind of brought that to, I think, a good way to see that connection. That God knew that He determined what the outcome was going to be, and yet it was their choice to disobey God and the evilness of their deeds that brought about that.
I mean, isn't that Deuteronomy though? I mean, it's saying the blessings and curses. He tells them, if you do these things are going to happen.
And when you choose a king over you, those kind of things. God is able to. I always say foreknowledge does not mean that He causes it, right? And so He knows that these are things that are going to happen based on their choice to disobey, their choice not to listen, not to hearken to His voice, essentially.
I got questions for you.
Okay.
We don't have to talk about it right now, but that reminds me of Jonah a little bit, where God says, I'm gonna destroy them in the prophecy, and then
He relents.
So just thinking, how that all shucks and jives together. So we'll talk about that some other time.
All right,
not for today.
Good.
Yeah. So Brian, thanks so much. I'm excited to get through Zechariah here,
too.
and it's good to get into the night vision number 1 and see what's going on there. And
sounds like a name of an album title.
Night Vision.
Night Vision number 1. I don't know.
A band name, called it Shotgun. Night Vision number 1. Anyway, all right. Well, Brian, thanks so much. I'm excited to get into this, and
make sure if you like this episode, share it with somebody else. Go to our website, see the show notes, go back and listen to Daniel again if you missed that.
Give us an idea of something you'd like to hear about, or questions you've got. You've been reading your Bible, and you're like, I'm not so sure about that. What do I think about that?
What you want to say about what we had to say today. So
absolutely.
We'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, we'd love to hear from you. Thanks so much, and we'll chat next Tuesday.
See ya.
Bye.